Well, Vitalik, how are you doing this morning?
It's been a good morning. I'm just in the process of writing some an article about where to use and not use blockchains. What other things have I been up to? Just a bunch of random things, but generally it's been good and it's been fun. How about you?
Doing really well. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. Uh, do you mind giving us kind of a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Sure. So I think people in general mostly know me for crypto stuff. So I joined the Bitcoin ecosystem back in 2011. So I was still in high school. I heard about Bitcoin a couple of times, once on the internet, once from my dad. And I thought, hey, this is interesting. This seems like an ecosystem that's doing something really cool. And so I started like really jumping in and participating in it. I started off as a writer. So I co-founded Bitcoin magazine with this guy named Mihai Alicia from Romania. And I was writing just a bunch of articles on all kinds of Bitcoin topics, including the technology, the economics, the politics and society related issues, and culture, just about everything. And a couple of years after that, I went into the crypto space full time, started exploring more projects, and eventually Ethereum started. And I have been part of the Ethereum project ever since. So the stuff that I generally do for Ethereum tends to have to do with research. So basically, coming up with like ways to improve the Ethereum protocol, kind of testing out some of those approaches, like coordinating with researchers and developers and like explaining things on those kinds of issues. Though I also have continued to kind of write and like think and do big picture stuff on a bunch of blockchain related issues. I guess the thing that's fascinating about blockchains, and that I think becomes even more true about systems like Ethereum than it was about Bitcoin, is that blockchains are this environment where you can create new organizations, you can create new systems of rules, you can create applications that encode ways in which large numbers of people interact with each other. And so there's a lot of kind of ideas around things like economics and sociology and like thinking through different disciplines about like how would people actually interact and use a particular application. Would some application break? Would some application not break? In what different circumstances? So I end up thinking about these ideas that are very relevant to things that are happening in Ethereum land, but that also do end up stretching further.
That makes a ton of sense. Vitalik, I'm curious. A lot of people think about you as a crypto person, but I actually think of you kind of as like being more interested in governance and political economy. And then crypto is almost like a way to get there. It's a way to innovate in that space in a way that people have not been able to do that in the recent past. Is that a fair assessment, or is kind of crypto actually the main thing?
No, I think that's definitely true. I think like I'm definitely not like into the coins for the coins. I'm that like to me blockchains definitely are this kind of way to open up this big space for people to experiment, have enough governance, communication, open up the ways that we can coordinate without relying on governments and corporations and all of these kinds of things. So yeah, and I think I'm definitely very interested in these kind of broader ends that I've always seen the crypto space as being about trying to accomplish.
Interesting. So on that note, our audience is, our audience has some degree of knowledge of crypto, but it's more of a general audience. We talk here mostly about policy and big ideas and kind of things like that. So, well, I guess we'll just jump right into it. We invited you on the show when we saw that you had retweeted some of our work. I had written this series of articles for Astral Codex 10 on the topic of land policy and Georgism, and I saw you had read it. So I guess we'll just jump right into that. First of all, you've read the series. What did you think of it?
I thought it was very interesting. I had been a fan of Georgism for a really long time. I think it was one of the political philosophies that really appealed to me, even back when I was just starting my learnings about what the different political philosophies are, and when I was still a Bitcoin magazine person. I was definitely, I guess, surprised about the conclusion of just how much revenue a land value tax might be able to capture. Like it's, as I remember, it was basically coming close to be able to replace like a whole bunch of other taxes, and that's, I think, not the usual take among kind of people out there in the world that are vaguely pro-Georgia. I'm right there. You know, like the more usual viewpoint is like, okay, yeah, I mean, I see the rationale for this sort of stuff, but like, come on, it's not like land is just such a tiny part of the economy; it's not going to get very far. And again, yeah, reading through that post, it was interesting to see like actually, just how big a part of the economy land is. And, on some level it does make sense, right? Like, especially given how people are talk about housing prices so much. And when you actually look at like the price of a house, in most places, only like a small portion of it is the actual house, right? Like one way to look at this is like if you get home insurance and you look at like what is the maximum amount that they pay out in the case that the you get a fire and the house completely breaks. So like relative to the price of a house, often it's pretty tiny, and so. And then comparing kind of like empty lots to full lots, and you notice that the empty lot is like 3/4 of the full lot. And if you're looking at buying a house from the point of view of buying a house, you're like WTF made, and there's and then even things like there was that study that said like if you let people build like even to a medium extent in places like San Francisco, the US's GDP could have been 36% higher, and like all these different things that stack up on top of each other, and you realize that like wait, it actually land is pretty significant and it is big, and yeah, I thought that was just generally a really interesting picture.
Cool. Did I leave anything out? Did you disagree with anything?
I don't think I disagreed with anything. I mean, I do think I have this kind of module in my mind that says don't let your mind get changed too much by like any one person's a single opinion, and there's always a chance that like some unknown unknowns are being left out, but I definitely would highly welcome and encourage more people kind of researching and double checking all this and trying to figure it out. I think in practice the biggest obstacles to like actually trying to land value taxify either America or other countries is that it like a land value instituting a large land value tax is basically a one-time transfer away from existing landowners, and existing landowners are going to get upset by that, and in a lot of cases existing landowners are this a fairly powerful political lobby. And, there are these kind of emotionally appealing arguments of like, all I have is this home, or you're going to tax away the home. And, in reality, like with land value schemes, you can always fix them and say, okay, fine, a third of the revenue goes into a citizen's dividend. That's actually totally enough to be able to afford an affordable home. And the people complaining are actually in the kind of top 5th percentile of richness. But, even still, like it's an emotionally appealing argument in politics works off of that sort of stuff. So it's like, it does feel like those kinds of political issues are probably more likely to be the kind of source of problems almost than even the math itself. And just to kind of go back to a previous topic, I think one of the things that interests me about like doing crypto in particular instead of doing getting into politics kind of the traditional way is that whenever you change you want to change an existing political system, like there's always going to be a lot of status quo pressure. You have to change huge numbers of people. There's like this really long lead time between developing an idea and any hope of having that idea implemented, and when it does get implemented, it's always going to be a kludge, whereas with a blockchain, it's like you create a new system, and you build the new system and it runs, and sometimes the thing breaks, as we saw happen with Terra a couple of months ago, but sometimes the thing doesn't break, and eventually we learn over time, and I'm hopeful that at some point the insights that we get from the crypto space are going to start making a bigger and bigger impact in the wider economy and society.
So that actually brings up a really interesting point that ties back into crypto. I think the general term for this phenomenon was coined by this guy called Gordon Tullock. He called it the transitional gains trap. And he used the example of taxi medallions, where the first generation to get some kind of particular benefit makes out like bandits. And then the next generation, the next generation, like the value of that thing might get like priced in. So like taxis might not be particularly profitable, but removing the medallion system will create overnight winners and losers. So now it's very politically fraught to do it. And so that's just to name the phenomenon we're both talking about, of any try to like remove some existing system that has this bought in interest. So you've just brought up, it's like one of the things that appeals to you about crypto is that it's like, okay, well, instead of having to like deal with all these politicians and stuff, we can create this new ecosystem. How long until that new ecosystem you've created has its own winners and losers baked into the status quo? Like Ethereum's trying to move from proof of work to proof of stake right now. Are you dealing with your own transitional gains trap, and do you have any insights there?
No, that's actually fascinating that you asked the question, because I was literally just about to raise that exact point. I think it definitely is an issue. I do think that it has been much less of an issue than especially people looking on Ethereum from the outside sometimes tend to assume. Like, I think we get more concern trolling about miners being expropriated than even miners complaining about the switch to proof of stake. And I think the big reason why this happened is because proof of stake isn't this like new thing that's being foisted on an ecosystem that never expected it. Proof of stake was part of the discussion in Ethereum since I've made that first post on Slasher in January 2014. And then there was a definite plan to move to proof of stake since at least November 2014, and maybe a bit earlier, right? So it feels like the goal of switching to proof of stake, the goal of implementing some scalability stuff like sharding, it was kind of part of Ethereum's living constitution almost from the beginning of the project. So it's this kind of interesting experiment where you have a community with these kind of constitution-like norms that are not just about preserving a particular thing that's already there, but also about trying our best to execute on this specific roadmap that everyone was aligned on. And there definitely are many people who do not like that roadmap, and a lot of people went somewhere else. When the DAO hack happened in 2016, I think that actually was a moment where Ethereum was just hit with a very unexpected situation, and it did act in a way that ended up violating a lot of people's expectations. And a lot of those people who were very unhappy about it rebelled and went over to Ethereum Classic. But one of the interesting side effects of that is that I think Ethereum Classic also actually managed to attract people who were unhappy with Ethereum for other reasons. So a lot of proof of work fans went over to Ethereum Classic. A lot of fans of Ethereum having a less aggressive and much more conservative roadmap and not bothering with sharding went to Ethereum Classic. And so that kind of moment even actually kind of purified Ethereum to some extent and made it more cohesive and more able to execute on its own particular values, which is also something that I found interesting. So I guess I definitely think that avoiding transitional gains traps is going to be an important thing for crypto ecosystems going forward as well, especially as they become more mature. But I also think that crypto is this very large design space, and so there are different both technical tools and social and political tools that you can use to deal with those kinds of issues. And I think Ethereum actually has done a pretty good job of that, and I think other blockchains can as well.
Vitalik, that's a great transition there. I want to talk about kind of your preferences. What constitutes good governance? kind of flows from base values. You seem very pragmatic and kind of non-ideological, which is an interesting contrast because I went to an early, in the early 2010s, I went to these early Bitcoin meetups, and you'd go out to the parking lot afterwards and people would show you their automatic rifles in the back of the trunk of their car, and all these like really wild things, very libertarian, very committed to these ideological things and unwilling to budge. But you seem much more pragmatic. What are kind of your base values that guide your ideal kind of governance structures?
Yeah, and I think openness is important, freedom is important. I think cosmopolitan ethical values are important to me. So, the idea of like not just caring about people that are either part of your country or that are otherwise kind of very close to you, but also thinking about the needs of people who are further away. I think just like how would I call it? Having positive sum relations with the outside world is also, I think, something that's definitely important to me. So I guess it stands in contrast with this kind of approach that tries to kind of like get internal cohesion by emphasizing its like extreme differences with everything that's outside of itself. Like that, I think, is closer to something that a lot of people in, say, the Bitcoin maximalist camp are in favor of. But I think Ethereum has always not really been that. And I think even pragmatism itself is kind of an ideological value too, like trying to kind of emphasize finding the good in all the different viewpoints. And like even if you don't agree with something, if you can identify some very cheap way to make people who do agree with that viewpoint happy, you should just go do it. So I think a combination of all of those.
So one thing, just kind of circling back to some things we had said before, you'd mentioned freedom's very important to you. You'd mentioned that, you kind of have a little different viewpoint than the Bitcoin maxis. But one thing I've noticed is that crypto culture in general has a very pretty strong anarchist streak. And I'm defining anarchy very, very broadly. Generally as people wanting to route around government in general and not having to deal with the political system, which is something you say you've bought into. But do you identify with anarchism in general, big capital A or lowercase a, and with the way that it manifests in crypto culture at all to any degree,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of ideas from that camp definitely kind of are ideas that I align and agree with. I mean, I even this morning made that tweet where I complained about how people keep using the word real name to refer to government names, which is something that I really hate. And there, like, by the way, there's actually, like, I guess kind of mainstream Western people, it might be a bit confusing to kind of really care because whatever your name is probably your name. But, there are these kind of other groups of people like foreigners, especially Asians. I talk to them a lot, right? Names are a more fluid thing. Transgender people, actually, I wasn't even thinking about them, but that was something that came up in the replies. But that, like, in general, that's definitely kind of like one small example of that. I do think that the crypto space is about trying to like create alternatives to things like governments for a lot of the kind of functions that people wants to do. Well, both governments and centralized corporations. I do think that there are two different ways in which you can kind of be, quote, anti-government. One way is to identify the government and its goals as an enemy and set yourself up to try to resist them. But the other way is to try to say, okay, the government is a medicine that is trying to solve very particular diseases that are very real. But, like chemotherapy in the 1960s, it's a medicine that has really bad side effects. And so can we create different medicines that have that don't have those side effects or have side effects that are less bad in some way? So I think in general, like the second approach in general appeals to me more than the first one. And I feel like in general, like if you try to do the first one without doing any of the second one, like I just worry that just kind of sets you up for conflict with the rest of the world too much. I do think that there are cases where the first one is just, what you're going for, and that's just kind of the way it is in your corner of the world, and you have to deal with it, right? So, like, for example, like I personally, do like talks to Russian activists quite a bit recently, and people that are kind of anti-war, trying to kind of push Russia into a healthier direction, and they are obviously having a very hard time because of their own government, and they're like it just is a fact of life that like they're in an environment where in a lot of cases like they are trying to kind of protect their activities from being interfered with by the local banking system, and privacy infringements, and the government seeing things and so forth. But at the same time, like trying to use that kind of frame as a frame for like this is the default way that all of society works. Like I think if everyone has that kind of conflict orientation mindset, then things can just easily completely break, right? So my general approach toward the freedom thing is basically to also like focus even more on this question of like, well, what are the things that people are actually looking for? So it could be protection of certain different kinds. It could be some kind of filtering and curation function. It could be public goods funding, and like try to find ways to provide at least a little bit of that, using the crypto tools that we have. I mean, as I've already said, I am a moderate. Like I'm not trying to like literally replace the entire government. So I definitely admire or align much more with kind of lowercase a and not really uppercase a. But that's in general where I'm coming from.
So this kind of reminds me of, to what degree does governance in crypto ultimately depend on real world governance? We have smart contracts, but we've seen instances where there's disputes and somehow or other these things get dragged into real world courts and settled by dumb contracts. So and I wonder to what degree this is like related to like the Oracle problem or things like that. So to what degree does ultimately the blockchain and smart contracts and any human agreement you want to put on a blockchain ultimately wind up getting appealed to the real world legal systems? I was wondering, like, to what sense does the Oracle problem kind of imply that real world government will always have a say in what goes on in crypto land?
So I do think that there have been a couple of instances of people kind of definitely going to some kind of social recourse in order to solve a problem that happens in their blockchain, but where that social recourse is still local to that community, and they end up solving the problem without relying on a government court completely. So one of those examples is the Steam versus Hive situation that I've written about a bunch and I keep coming back to, right? Basically,
and to be clear, Steam here is STEEM, the blockchain, yes, not the non-blockchain video game store.
Correct. Yeah. So STEM is a social network, a blockchain-based social network. The goal was that you have a token and you can like pay to vote, and people could get paid for making good content and all of these different ideas. So it was originally owned by one group of people, but then Justin Sun, this very not reputable crypto character, came in and bought the company. And the company originally held I think it was 20% of all the Steam tokens, but there was this community expectation that those coins were kind of held in trust and they're supposed to be used for the goal of making the Steam ecosystem better. But then the company ended up being transferred to Justin Sun, and Justin Sun is this outsider who has completely different values, where, basically, as far as I can tell, Justin Sun's ideological values are just make Justin Sun great again. So this immediately started a bunch of tension, and eventually Justin ended up like basically getting enough kind of proof validators on on like voting nodes on the proof of stake network to lock out the people who are opposing him, and basically kind of secure full control of the Steem chain, right? So the Steem blockchain, like it had this version of proof of stake, which is so totally not the same as Ethereum, right? In Ethereum, like all that the proof of stake validators are doing is they're just keeping the chain going and accepting transactions. In Steem, they also had this power to kind of vote and make pretty much arbitrary governance decisions. So they kind of locked everyone else out. And the community was unhappy about this. And so the community made a fork of Steem. Incidentally, they had to call it Hive. And here, I think the existence of government law and trade actually went against what I thought was the good outcome, because Steem, the company, had the trademark, and so they had to name it something else. And so in some ways, they kind of lost half the battle right there. But they created Hive, and there was this mass migration to Hive. And on the Hive chain, the coins belonging to anyone who has participated in Justin Sun's attack got deleted, right? It's like when you make a new coin, you can just kind of make the supply of the coin be whatever you want, right? And anyone could make a version of Ethereum that's like Ethereum Vitalik is evil edition, where they just delete my balance. And if people really decide that I'm evil so much they want to switch to it, then like they've done it, right? Now, I think Hive has like a roughly comparable valuation to Steem. I think I forget. Last time I checked, it was a bit higher, but like sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. But like that's an example of off-chain resolution that is also not legal system based, right? So that happens sometimes. Other times, though, there's definitely cases where the resolution is legal system based, right? So, like, for example, a lot of the time contracts and projects within the blockchain space get hacked. And sometimes the hackers end up returning the money because, in part, they're afraid of legal consequences going to them. Or sometimes the hackers offer to kind of voluntarily return 95% in exchange for the remaining 5% of their money getting legalized. And because it's so hard to like actually spend $60 million of illegally obtained money from a hack, like that actually turns out to be a win-win. A hack turns into a security bounty. So there are lots of cases of that kind of legal recourse happening too. I think in general, like my view on this is that if courts and law disappeared, and assuming that in such a world, the internet was able to keep functioning, which I think is probably not true of the internet today, but probably would be true of an internet that actually was optimized around the world being more dangerous. So one partial example of this might be, the war in Ukraine and how Elon just brought in all of these Starlink nodes, and they actually have been very effective at kind of keeping all the different parts of Ukraine connected. Like I think even, kept Azovstal connected to the world almost up until the very end. So that, if you imagine basically, if the internet did exist, then people would be able to cooperate. You have cryptographic keys; they would be able to solve things off chain. But at the same time, the number of problems that you have would just kind of be one or two levels higher than the number of problems that you have today, right? So I think it's not an either-or thing. It's like the government exists whether we like it or not, and courts exist whether we like them or not. And so there are a lot of cases where you can kind of gain some benefit by appealing to them in some situations, and so people do. And on net, that's probably reduced the number of the amount of terrible stuff happening in the crypto space, which is good.
Yeah, two follow-up questions on that, and then I want to kick it back more to questions of governance. But I thought it was really interesting that in the Steem and the Hive divorce, it's interesting that you kind of pointed out that one of the things that didn't come over was the trademark, which is something that only exists in the off-chain legal world, and is something that it's an off-chain asset, right? A trademark, and it's a court that adjudicates that. So it was interesting that they could get everything but that. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, as well as when you say the word hack, there's different kinds of hacks, right? There's the kind of hack where you steal a bunch of passwords and gain unauthorized access. And then there's the kind of hack where you do what the smart contract allows, but is not what anyone actually meant, and cause all kinds of havoc. And there's the whole like code is law question. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the tension between those two subjects.
But sorry, so what are the two subjects?
The two subjects is the, I probably should have asked them one at a time, but the first one was, so in the Steam Hive thing, they were able to do off-chain resolution, but the one thing they weren't able to resolve was a legal conflict ultimately over the trademark. Right. And so is there anything interesting to say about that? Like, is that just the Oracle problem? Is there any way to stuff the trademark rights on chain?
Right. I mean, theoretically, there is, right? Like, we have ENS, the Ethereum name system, and like I have Vitalik.eth, the name. But, if you manage to hack that particular wallet, then, you could have Vitalik.eth for yourself. And, I could sue you, but, you could transfer it to an Anon account and it might never be able to find it again. And I might be able to do things like, complain to Etherscan and complain to some of the centralized ecosystem providers, and they kind of at the interface layer might blacklist Vitalik.eth, right? So like that might be possible, but what they're not going to do is I'm never going to get Vitalik.eth back. So now, of course, if I want to, I can make my holding of Vitalik.eth still be very secure, right? So in the crypto space, there is this concept that I've been a big proponent of for a long time called social recovery wallets, where basically it's a special kind of wallet account, which is a smart contract. And the rules basically say that you define a fairly large group of people. So in the case of the wallet that contains like all of my money, for example, this is public on-chain information. It's a 4 of 6. Basically, so there's some group of people, and the majority of those people need to sign off in order to make something happen. So like it could move Vitalik.eth over to that wallet. It could even move Vitalik.eth into a contract where kind of I could unilaterally do things with that name, but then if it ever gets stolen or if it ever gets lost, I could kind of call up that group of 4 of 6 and force them to transfer it back. So crypto does offer these kinds of things that could kind of get the risk of things like loss or theft to be reduced to a very low number. The technique is actually very similar to what WeChat uses for account recovery. Like in WeChat, when you recover your account, you also have to like basically call up to the 2 of your friends and get them to send a 6-digit code to you. Which is interesting, right? Like even in those cases where a centralized resolution is obviously completely available, like sometimes these kinds of techniques also have to be used just for efficiency purposes, right?
Yeah.
So I think in the trademark Justin Sun Steam case, one way to read that situation from a political economy perspective is where basically you have a local level of government, which is the Steam blockchain, and then you have a kind of central, more distant layer of government, which is the trademark ecosystem. And the higher, like the more central layer of government was just socially too far away from the situation and didn't understand the specifics of the situation and like local community morals well enough to be able to give the correct outcome, right? So that's kind of more generally, I guess, an argument for trying to make some of these government functions more kind of local. And I don't necessarily mean spatially local, because I think in the 21st century, individual towns are kind of less important as a locus of community than they were historically. I mean, like socially local. So I do think that like blockchains and DAOs and things happening in the crypto space and kind of trying to handle most things themselves is a good example of making that happen.
Okay, so well, as a transition question to get us back to some topics of governance, one of the chief pitches of crypto is decentralization. But we keep seeing this trend of centralization anyway, and this comes in many forms, whether it's services that just will stick a private database right in the middle between a blockchain and its users, or consolidation of mining power, concentrated coin ownership, or DAOs that are owned effectively by 3 people. How do you fight this tendency towards re-centralization, or, assuming you think it's a bad thing, just do you have any thoughts on that kind of trend towards centralization versus the tension of the initial pitch of decentralization?
Mm. I mean, I definitely think that it's a concern, and I definitely have been getting more and more open to this viewpoint that if you want some particular like layer of an ecosystem to be decentralized, then that decentralization has to be to some degree an intentional and ongoing effort. Right, like that's the philosophy behind antitrust law, for example, to some extent, right? Like that, you want to have some kind of like explicit government thing that pushes for competition to continue to exist, because otherwise the competitors do end up kind of calling each other and banding together. I think in the crypto space, obviously, there isn't a government enforcing antitrust law, but there are these other kind of community driven levers, right? So one of them is just like reputation and people's desire to be a good person and be seen as a good person. And this happened in both Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? Like I think in Bitcoin, there was a situation back in 2013 when a single mining pool that was called a ghash.io got to 51% of the total Bitcoin network hash power, which basically meant that they have been able to unilaterally rewrite the chain to be whatever they want. And everyone noticed this. And there was this large movement to try to get people off of Ghash. And it actually worked, right? And the percentage went kind of down pretty quickly. And I think after that, I forget the details, this was a long time ago, but I believe that they even made a public commitment to not let their market share go above 40% after that, which I thought was a very kind of lovely and pro-social move of them, right? So there's those kinds of levers. Another lever is, of course, like protocol design and trying really hard to actually design the protocol to not have economies of scale and even to have diseconomies of scale to some extent. So one interesting example of this in Ethereum, in the Ethereum proof of stake design, is we have this concept of anti-correlation penalties. What an anti-correlation penalty means is basically that when you, as a proof of stake validator node, do something clearly bad, so like sign two conflicting blocks at the same time, for example, then the amount that you get penalized is proportional to the number of other validators that do something wrong at almost the same time. So you get penalized more if you fail at the same time as other people, and you get penalized actually very little, like only about 3% of the amount, if you get penalized at a time when no one else is getting penalized. So the idea here is basically to discourage people from joining the largest pool, to discourage people from even putting their staking on the same cloud service as everyone else, to discourage people from sometimes even running the same software or relying on being in the same geographic zone as everyone else. So in some ways, it's like this intentional effort to create the exact opposite of the nobody got fired for buying IBM effect, right? This is this kind of conformist effects that exist in a lot of real world contexts, where if you make a decision that leads to something bad, but you were just following common wisdom, then you never actually get punished, because the guy was just following common wisdom. But if you do something different from other people and that leads to something bad, then like all the blame goes on you. And so in the proof of stake case, like it's intentionally trying to create the exact opposite, right? It's like, no, if you do something that's the same as everyone else and it leads to something bad, that's when you lose all your money. And there are signs that it's effective. Like we've talked to even staking pool providers, some of the big ones, and some of them have been decentralizing between different providers and different software implementations internally, because they were afraid of like one of them failing, leading to a huge amount of money getting lost. So that was actually interesting. You even aligned selfish incentives with the decentralization goal. So yeah, and I think there's a lot that you can do with these kind of protocol changes that try to deliberately remove economies of scale where possible, add these diseconomies of scale where possible. But then also, I think there is some extent to which there might be economies of scale that can't be removed. And the only way that we really have to compensate for that is by appealing to this kind of community morals and social governance layer sometimes.
So I'll kick this next one over to you, Will, because that I think is a good bridge to questions about voting systems.
Absolutely, absolutely. So recently, Vitalik, actually, like 3 days ago, we talked to someone who's working on approval voting. They've had a lot of traction. They've gotten a lot of success in implementing approval voting in South Dakota. They're working on Seattle, Washington now. They raised a lot of money from open philanthropy, and it's been going really well. I'm curious. You're interested in quadratic voting, a lot of these other interesting systems. Can you contrast quadratic voting with approval voting? And is there, in some sense, like I guess a trade-off? And Lars, you might have a better phrasing than I do for this, between like a system that's like more optimal but is harder to explain and kind of illegible to people, to one that's like easy to explain and somewhat easier to implement.
Right. So I guess the general like theory of why existing voting is broken like starts with the Arrow's theorem, all right, where you basically there's like this list of fairly simple and like very intuitive properties that a voting system that's sane should obviously have, and it turns out that it's mathematically impossible to create one if there's more than two candidates, and so, like that's why we have issues like the whole strategic voting thing, where if there might be a lot of people that like one particular candidate, but if there is this kind of self-reinforcing impression that that candidate has no chance, then everyone votes for just the lesser of two evils out of the two that do have a chance. I guess so. Approval voting is one way of getting around Arrow's theorem, right? I do think Arrow's theorem is overrated by a lot of people. Like Arrow's theorem, basically, it often gets cited as this kind of general theory why politics sucks and why it has to suck. And like the reason why that's not true is because Arrow's theorem is like specifically reliant on this concept of ordinal preferences, right? That like it assumes that the thing that you are inputting is is A better than B, is A better than C, is B better than C, without being able to say by how much is A better than B, or which ones do I just think are fine and which ones do I think are not fine. I actually have my own candidate for kind of the mathematical theorem that is the general reason why politics sucks, which is I talk about this in one of my blog posts on coordination. It's basically the fact that in the individual choice model, so where games are like in game theory, where everyone's making decisions separately, you can have games that have equilibria. But in the cooperative game theory setting, so where you assume that kind of subsets of players can actually talk to each other and have shared collective strategies, there's actually a wide class of games where there isn't even an equilibrium. Like it's basically doomed to be chaotic. So I thought that was just a bit of a fascinating aside, right? But approval voting does change the issue or solve the Arrow's theorem problem. Basically, because instead of saying who's better than who, you're just saying which candidates am I fine with, which candidates am I not fine with. Quadratic voting is interesting in that it's like range voting in that you get to kind of score like in a very fine-grained way, well, how much do you like each candidate, right? But range voting has this problem that like if you think some candidate is good at all, then if that they're going to do an average, and let's say if the average is 55 and your actual opinion is 70, you vote 70, it might increase it to 55.01. But if you instead vote 100, then you're going to increase the average to 55.03, right? So it's just always everyone's incentive to vote either 0 or 100, and it collapses down to approval voting. But quadratic voting fixes that problem by making your votes like have a cost, right? And have a quadratic cost. So if you want to vote with a score of 1, that costs you 1 credit. If you want to vote with a score of 2, that costs 4 credits. If you want to vote with a score of 3, that has 9 credits. And so the more extreme your vote gets, the more expensive in terms of kind of sacrificing your ability to vote on all the other issues does it get to vote even like kind of 1 unit further, right? And it turns out that there's a bunch of really nice math why quadratic voting is optimal. And it does basically perfectly compensate for this kind of 0 and 100 bias that range voting has. So quadratic voting basically, it's great because it allows you to express these preferences that have varying levels of strength, where some people might be weakly against an issue, some other people might be strongly in favor of or against an issue. And it does it in this kind of more inclusive way where it's part of the protocol. Because as opposed to like, say, for example, like NIMBYism, right, where you do have a small number of people that's like heavily against, housing being built. But the way that kind of city hall meetings and the whole system is structured work is that it basically, really selects for like a particular group of people that just have a lot of time on their hands to like go into these meetings and keep talking and shutting everyone down, right? So whereas with quadratic voting, it's like there is a way to express the fact that you feel something strongly or feel something weakly, but it's done in this kind of more equal way where just everyone gets some number of credits and you can just go and vote.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking more on, NIMBYism and your kind of thoughts on governance, you've written this article talking about this dynamic between vetocracy and bulldozer mentality. I was wondering if you could briefly summarize, just in a couple sentences, what that means for our audience and how that drives your thinking and ties into the things we've talked about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so vetocracy versus bulldozer was kind of my attempt to like show a different conceptualization of like political divides that we have, right? So I think people are used to left versus right and authoritarian versus libertarian, but there's a lot of people and like a lot of movements and viewpoints that really cut across both in a way that feels inconsistent, but actually is very consistent. And so the the vetocracy versus bulldozer kind of axis basically says on the vetocracy side, you have systems that are biased toward inaction and toward doing nothing unless almost everyone agrees on a move in a particular direction and giving lots of different participants veto power. Whereas bulldozerism is basically, systems where you do give like particular single individuals or potentially large groups just the ability to kind of move things. And it's, don't ask for permission, beg forgiveness sort of ethos. So one of the criticisms of contemporary America that you see recently, I think it was hard for people to articulate, especially if you think in the left versus right and libertarian versus authoritarian sense, because the criticism has aspects to it that appear on all sides of the spectrum, right? And the criticism basically does say that, hey, look, America is a vetocracy, right? So some examples of this are that you get people who, for example, criticize government for being ineffective and not being able to agree on new laws or even be able to do local things. Like there was this fairly famous big article, I think 1 or 2 years back, just talking about why Penn Station is terrible and how no one has managed to upgrade it for a really long time. At the same time, you have the criticism that private property gets kind of really respected and it's really hard to do even very needed things if they go against private property in some senses. And at the same time, you get this criticism of NIMBYism, and which is weird, right? Because if your viewpoint is the problem with America is that it doesn't value the need to do collective good things because it respects individual freedom too much, but California zoning codes are the exact opposite of respecting individual freedom, right? So that's kind of the totally 45 degrees off wrong axis by which to even make that case, right? So if instead you say, well, the problem actually is that America is vetocratic and that this is a big problem, then that actually makes sense, right? And I think there is a good kind of way to shape the historical story for why this happens, right? Because there is a left vetocracy, there is right vetocracy, and I think you can view a lot of it as being a reaction to authoritarian high modernism in the early 20th century, right? So both Hitler type stuff, but also Robert Moses and some of that kind of urban planning stuff that just did a lot of bulldozing that ended up really hurting people. And so there's this viewpoint that okay, if you let great men just go around and have power like that, then they're going to do terrible things. And so you can have the left wing response to that, which is dominated by things by saying we need community input and we need to make systems that make sure that something like that can't happen without community input. And then there is the more right-leaning libertarian response that says, well, see, this is why personal property really needs to be protected. But really, they're in some ways part of the same trend. And in some ways, the kinds of problems that too much of that mentality causes are also very similar problems, right? Like, if you have a system where you have total private property and there just is no eminent domain, then, how are you ever going to build something like a high-speed rail, right? Like, at some point, once you start buying up the houses, everyone else that's kind of in the middle of the path, they're going to realize that this is going on and that their consent is like basically required for this multi-billion-dollar project to finish. And so they're going to bid things up by a factor of 5. Just coordination between like kind of different government bodies is often a problem, and all of these different reasons why stuff is expensive in the US. So if you make that criticism on the like Vitocracy versus bulldozer axis, and you basically say, well, the problem is that maybe America needs to be willing to be a little more bulldozery, then like the argument just feels kind of more coherent, right? So that's in the US context. In the crypto context, I think one of the things I mentioned in the article is that I think crypto has this interesting duality to it, in that crypto often is accomplishing some pretty bulldozery ends, right? It's basically saying, look at these sclerotic financial systems that are not updating to the modern age. It's still incredibly hard to send money internationally. So we're just not going to bother interfacing with this existing system. We're just going to like go ahead and build our own. Here we have a currency. You can now transfer it from Kyrgyzstan to Guatemala as quickly as you can transfer an email. And, you can go use it and it's great. And, good luck trying to stop us. But at the same time, the mechanisms that cryptocurrency uses to protect itself internally are very vetocratic, right? And this is especially true in the Bitcoin space because, in the Bitcoin space, there's this very conservative developer ethos. And there basically is a group of like a couple of dozen people where any single one of them can basically stonewall a particular proposal to the point where it either just can't happen or it takes a really long time to happen, right? And there's this really strong bias that like Bitcoin is not a majority vote system. It's not a democracy. You actually do need consensus, and consensus basically means no significant disagreement that kind of the Bitcoinerati elite decide is technically reasonable. So Ethereum, I think, also has this to some extent. Like it is weaker. I think in part because Ethereum also has this like constitution around like moving to proof of stake and moving to sharding. But there are also pretty strong vetocracy norms, like especially around things like immutability and just not going around and changing the state to like rescue accounts that got hacked, for example.
Yeah, so that kind of brings up like the whole first mover, second mover advantage. There's this common criticism of blockchain is the environmental issue. A lot of modern L1s and L2s that are coming out are now kind of proof of stake is kind of table stakes for environmental reasons and also just for, transaction time and cost reasons. Bitcoin was the first, and so they had the advantage. They got all this mind share, but then they're also kind of locked into this vetocracy, as you say. Like, I don't see Bitcoin changing like in major ways anytime soon. Ethereum had your second mover advantages because you could see what happened with Bitcoin. But I guess the question I'm kind of asking is if you could talk about first mover and second mover advantages and disadvantages, and like if you had all the knowledge you had now and crypto revolution hadn't started yet, and you were now going to found Ethereum, like what would you do different basically with knowledge of these first and second mover advantages and disadvantages?
I do think that there were a lot of these kind of specific technical things that I would love to like transmit to myself back in 2014. So things like, for example, don't bother trying to make this really complicated and perfect proof of stake from the beginning. Instead, start off with a simpler proof of stake and upgrade it over time. Things like a lot of particular places in the protocol where the protocol could have been designed to be a lot simpler. So there's a lot of these different lessons that I think we've learned from Ethereum's progress so far. And a lot of those things are fixable, but just because Ethereum is a living system, it takes much longer to fix them. And Ethereum itself did end up learning quite a bit from Bitcoin, right? So like, for example, one of the political problems that Bitcoin has, I think, is because there is this one central Bitcoin client, the Bitcoin Core software implementation. That basically creates this elite of core developers where those are the ones that have veto power over a change, right? And it's very hard to basically for an outsider to come in and start participating in Bitcoin governance on their own terms, kind of without respecting the existing establishment and its values. And so that easily leads to being kind of sclerotic in a lot of ways. So what Ethereum did is it basically said, we're not going to have one client, we're going to have a bunch of clients, and anyone will start their own client. The Ethereum Foundation is going to work on a client, but we're going to work on a client that's written in Python, which is a very slow programming language. So it's basically just like an implementation that's set up to fail and in a market. It's just there to kind of show people how it's done and just experiment with the ideas, right? So that's something that it's a choice that we made. Actually, we made two iterations of the choice. Interestingly enough, so when Ethereum first launched, there was the Go client, the C++ client, but what happened was that we ended up launching, like basically being forced to launch more quickly. Fairly quickly because it ended up taking much longer than anyone expected. It ended up taking about like 20 months, and people were just so tired of Ethereum not launching that they were like, hey, this thing has to come out already. And so because of that, only one client, Geth, was really ready at launch time. And so the other clients were not ready. And so like none of the other clients ever really had a chance. So then after that, there was the Parity client, which was started by an outside team, and that succeeded for a while. But then the Parity team went off to do Polkadot, and so they stopped working on that client. And now, actually, we have like Nethermind, Aragon, Besu. We have a couple of alternatives, and it's finally becoming healthier, but that took a long time. But Ethereum's, during our switch to proof of stake, we actually learned from our own round one failure. And that's when we decided on this approach that the foundation is only going to do the Python client, and the foundation will kind of actively subsidize any kind of competent seeming group that's trying to make a different client. And so now we actually do have this diverse ecosystem of these 4 or 5 pretty high quality implementations of Ethereum's proof of stake side. So that's an example. So there was an example of, I guess, Ethereum learning from Bitcoin and then Ethereum learning from itself. And then, there's, of course, these newer projects that claim to be learning from Ethereum and that try to kind of avoid what they see as being some of Ethereum's issues, which is interesting to see. I think it's interesting because sometimes they do identify things that, like, if Ethereum easily could, we would love to adopt. Sometimes they identify things that like actually don't really matter that much. And then sometimes they identify things that I just like disagree with, right? So a lot of those chains tends to be much more comfortable with higher levels of centralization, for example, right? And that's something that I think both I and the Ethereum community are not comfortable with. So that's a case of just them deciding to, make a kind of fundamentally incompatible different products. And so we have, 2 ecosystems, and everyone just goes to whichever one appeals more to them personally.
So go ahead, Will.
If Lars, you can go ahead and ask your question. I've got one last one.
Yeah, well, I wanted to tie this back together, crypto and Georgism together. I wanted to ask a quick question to kind of tie those two together. Was there's been this whole trend of virtual real estate on chain, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that phenomenon. I have my own thoughts, and I've written extensively about it, but I think it's kind of this interesting confluence of land economics and crypto.
Yeah, I think it's a very fascinating topic. I think it's part of this like broader topic in crypto that I've been trying to push for, which is like, if you have a crypto project that can create this like limited supply asset that people end up wanting and being willing to pay huge amounts of money for, then I think we should create systems that try to kind of channel that revenue into funding like public goods in the ecosystem that it would otherwise get underfunded, right? Like I think the way that Glenn Weil says it is tax the congestible, subsidize the increasing returns, right? So it's like tax the thing where if more people participate, the experience becomes worse for each person, and use that revenue to subsidize the thing where if more people participate, it becomes better for each person. And so you kind of like fix one of the big economic imbalances there, right? So in terms of like things that are congestible in crypto lands, like obviously there is just the token supply, right? So there's a fixed number of tokens, and if you issue an unlimited number of tokens, the whole thing breaks, and that the ability to issue that limited number of tokens becomes this sort of congestible resource that you can get revenue from allocating. Another one is block space, right? If block space was infinite and everyone could send as many transactions on Ethereum as they wanted, it would be impossible to run a node. And so there's a fixed amount of space. And so Ethereum automatically auctions that space. And since about a year now, the revenues from those auctions get burned, right? This was EIP 1559. The main goal of EIP 1559 was originally actually to get rid of first price auction inefficiencies. It was this kind of technocratic kind of economic thing that basically said, hey, look at what game theory says about how auctions work today, and let's make a better one. But it had the side effects that it also actually burns those coins. But then also there are other kind of congestion effects in blockchains. Land is an excellent one. ENS names are also an excellent one, right? Like there's only a limited number of 3-letter and 4-letter ENS names. There's things like the right to include transactions in a block first. This is the thing that the cool kids in crypto call MEV extraction. Like basically there's a lot of revenue that you can gain from being able to choose just the first transaction. You can do arbitrage of on-chain things and so forth. There's limited issue NFTs, obviously, right? So there's this long list of things that are in the crypto space that have like some kind of congestion effect or benefit from being a limited supply in some way. And I think, the idea of actually capturing that revenue and then putting that revenue toward, funding things that would otherwise be incredibly hard to fund is so like one of those things that I think the crypto space already is doing to some extent, but potentially could do really well. And it's also one of those places where I'm hopeful that there might be some innovations there that then get exported to other contexts.
That's great. Well, Vitalik, one more quick question. You've got your whole life ahead of you. You've got the attention of the world. What problems do you want to help solve through the rest of your life, and how do you prioritize those problems?
It's definitely a good one. I think like around now is an interesting time for myself personally, because it's getting to the point where Ethereum research is ossifying, right? So it's the amount of stuff that's changing in the Ethereum roadmap is becoming lower and lower. The Ethereum Foundation's level of quality has just shot up massively over the last 3 or 4 years, to the point where it's gone from me being like basically indispensable to any kind of research happening to the point where there are these really amazing and smart teams and individuals that are capable of making these very high quality proposals themselves. And at the same time, it's also getting to the point where like we understand what blockchains are like and we understand what blockchains will be like. And so a lot of the stuff that hasn't been done yet is going to happen at the higher levels of the ecosystem. And so lately I have been getting more interested in the higher level questions, and these questions of like, what are some good Ethereum applications that don't exist yet, how to make DAOs work better, how to make decentralized identity work better, and these kinds of things also end up kind of quickly hitting into these questions of kind of political economy and psychology and how people interact with each other even more than blockchains themselves do. So it feels like I'm going to be whacking my head against that, and both in the Ethereum ecosystem and also in kind of increasingly in kind of some of these efforts outside. And I think increasingly over time, those spheres are going to even start merging for quite a while.
That's excellent. Well, Vitalik, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you too. This is a great one.